Good morning, everybody.
Nice, Julian.
That's not an educator crowd. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Ah, that's an educator crowd. Okay. I have been privileged to work with just about everybody in this room. And from multiple vantage points, from a university perspective, from a foundation perspective, from a system perspective for that. And the one thing that I know to be true is that there are really bright people in this room, and there are people of goodwill and generosity in this room who are absolutely committed to Chicago's young people. That is without question. And last night at the Economic Club, Mayor Emanuel spoke, and he spoke on education. His speech was very inspirational, and it showed his deep commitment to his fundamental priority of improving education here, recognizing that that is, and the linchpin to everything else, good or bad, that happens in Chicago, from the quality of life in our neighborhoods to our economic prosperity for that. And so we're very fortunate to have, yet again, another mayor who is really focused on education. As if it doesn't come from the top, it just won't happen for that. And it's been a real privilege to work now 11 years at the Chicago Community Trust on education, and to have the deep partnership with the Searle family, and very pleased that we're joined by Nydia Searle today and Renee Michaels, who is mans the kinship family office for Searles. And without their support, we would not have been able to provide the level of grants that have fueled so much of the important work that we've been able to support, and that many of you in the room have been recipients of. So we're very grateful for their steadfast commitment. The other thing that we're grateful of is the existence of the University of Chicago's Consortium on Chicago School Research. No other place in the country has an organization of this capacity, this longevity. Who else could you ask to do a 20-year retrospective of progress? Who else would have that type of data? Who else would have the iterative development of analytic tools and methodologies to be able to examine data in meaningful ways and provide an honest and fair presentation of those data for that? And it is this engine that has enabled us to continue to progress and deepen our understanding of what works and what does not work in public education. So really appreciate the leadership of this organization. So what do we know to be true? One, we know that school improvement is a long-term proposition. There are no quick fixes or silver bullets for this. There are no singular solutions, pixie dust or magic beans that can lead the way for this, but it takes concerted efforts on lots of dimensions for that. The other finding that I thought was very revealing from the study was the issue of how we measure improvement matters, and that we need to be able to utilize a set of common and validated metrics here. Because we live in an era, a market society, where we have lots of vendors touting their particular solution to school reform, and people can generally cause the data to reflect what they want it to reflect. But without the unbiased and objective point of view of the consortium, it's hard to sort out what is really working and what isn't. And generally what we find is, at the end of the day, if all of the claims were true from all of the school reform groups that have been operating over the past 2 decades, then we would expect our students to, across the board, be well above average, and our ACT scores should probably be like 25 on average or something like that, if we were to believe the hype that we see day in and day out. So I think part of this is a commitment across the board, and to ask all of the partners who are engaged in this is to be honest and truthful and forthcoming about your data, and to recognize that at the end of the day, we are a community of learners trying to figure this out, trying to get this right, and that there are no simple answers to what is a very heavy lift in the face of massive challenges in our communities. So, you know, it's no accident in my mind that the widening of the achievement gap maps neatly onto the widening of the wealth disparity gap in this country. They both have their origins about 1980 and move forward from that. We see widening gaps in access to health care and the cost of health care in this country. We see the widening gaps for the cost of higher education and the student debt burden for young people. There are a lot of trends that are going in the wrong direction if our goal is to educate our entire citizenry to the high levels that are required to be an effective citizen in this country, and to effectively operate as a global citizen, when in the next decade, students who are currently in kindergarten in our public schools, before they get out of their K-12 schooling, China will have surpassed the United States as the world's largest economy. That is a very different circumstance. And it was my mantra as head of the Chicago Public Schools that we need to prepare young people for their future, not our past, in the fact that we are living in an era of massive change that is accelerating, meaning that we don't have the luxury of slow evolving change in our public schools, but needing to develop the wherewithal to move most rapidly. And that's why it's very important that we move away from a view of American exceptionalism of having the world's best universities, the world's best public education system, and start to look around the globe to see what other people are doing. Because as the OECD studies show, as Mark Tucker's studies show, we are standing still while the rest of the world is moving ahead. And so needing to open our framework. I was in Detroit in the late 70s, early 80s, and there it was that dawning of the period when the American auto industry was being outcompeted by Japan. And so finally, the American industrial complex did something unusual. They started to look around the globe and benchmark against the world's best. And that has led to an era of improvement in our own manufacturing capacity. Likewise, with education, we need to look around the globe for that. So as a result of leadership from my executive committee at the Chicago Community Trust, funding from the Searle family, we said we need to level the playing field and to create a baseline. We have new mayoral leadership. We've got new leadership for the Chicago Public Schools. We need to give them a baseline from which to start. And so with that, it's a, let's do this retrospective study, look back at the 3 eras of school reform and the impact that they had. We actually had no idea of what the findings would be. In fact, I was believing the hype. I thought that we were going to show dramatic improvements during this period of time for that. Turns out somewhat different for that. and we will hear that story here. But I'm very thrilled at the great turnout that we've got from everybody. Very appreciative of my colleagues Peggy Miller and Gedalia Lopez, who throughout this whole period have been really tremendous colleagues, not only in terms of grant making, but actively providing leadership and being engaged with many of you around the room to help formulate high potential strategies for improvement. Again, many of you provide important leadership for that. A person that I've been privileged to work with for a number of years and has provided leadership early on in school reform and continues today is going to be our moderator, Al Bennet from Roosevelt University. So it's my pleasure to bring him forward to lead the rest of our program. Thank you.
That was a dramatic pause. So for those of you who don't know me, I have the tendency to engage in dramatic pauses. So let's get started. There's some kind of management things I need to tell you about. There are index cards either at where you are or they will be shortly. And as the authors are presenting, would you please write down your questions that you have for them? I will then grade them based on how relevant I think they are, and we'll see where we go. But really that's important. There will be a couple of sweeps through, midway through and toward the end, and then we'll have a kind of conversation. I think the critical factor here is that while we will have kind of information shared, we do want to have a conversation. We want to have an active, engaged discussion that is not surface. And so if I push you to kind of dig deeper, excuse me, don't be offended. It's just where we need to be, given the severity of the issues that we face. Let me now turn the conversation over to three of the authors of this report. To my right, Elaine Allensworth, Paul Moore, and Stuart Luppescu. They will spend some time kind of going over the fine points of their work, and then I'll come back and we'll have a conversation. Elaine?
Thanks, Al. So back in 1988, I don't know if you all remember this, the Secretary of Education called Chicago schools the worst in the nation. Now, we could debate about whether that's true or not. Certainly, the school system had a long way to go. Since then, Chicago has undergone a whole series of major initiatives to try to improve student achievement. In fact, I would say in some ways they've led the nation in a number of really large reforms that have been copied by cities throughout the country in subsequent years. Now, we took on this commission from the Chicago Community Trust because there's been a lot of confusion out there about whether all of these reform efforts have actually resulted in progress in Chicago's schools. There's been a lot of criticism of the statistics that are out there to judge progress in the schools. And you know what? A lot of that criticism is very well founded. Luckily for us, the school district has made the raw student data available to us so that we can create our own indicators of progress over time. Now, it took us a while to do this. Even though we have years and years of experience working with the data, our communications director likes to say it took 3 PhDs, 2 years to actually come up with indicators that you could use to measure progress over time. How is the general public supposed to know what's happening with the schools, right, if it took us that long? Because, there's a lot of work that needed to be done. There are problems with the tests and the comparability of the tests over time, the way that they're scored over the time. In some years, up to a quarter of students' scores weren't even included in the public statistics. We have retention policies, grade promotion policies that shuffled students around in different grades, so kept the low-performing kids in the elementary grades for extra years, so you get them counted more, and then they don't move into the high schools, so they're not counted in the high schools. So lots of changes that really make the statistics that are out there non-comparable. So everything that we're going to show you is based on the cleaned up data, right, using indicators that actually can be compared over time. Now we divide these 20 years into 3 general eras. The first era is the time when the authority was decentralized away from the central office, and local school councils were created, comprised of parents and community members and teachers, to really take control of the schools at a local level, with authority over principal hiring and firing and curriculum and spending. The second period is the period when mayoral control starts in the schools, and Paul Vallis became CEO. This was a time when there was stability in district leadership. Paul Vallis was CEO for 5 years. There was a lot of investment in infrastructure in the schools. But we call this the era of accountability because it was also a time when the district started using standardized tests to make very high-stakes decisions about students and about schools. So this is the time when promotion standards were put into place so that students had to get minimum scores on tests to be promoted out of grades 3, 6, and 8. It was a time when schools had to have minimum percentage of students scoring at or above national norms in order to avoid being put on probation and potentially reconstituted. And the last era we call the era of diversification. This is after Paul Vallis left and Arne Duncan became CEO of the schools. And we call it diversification because this was a time of a lot of investment in curriculum and professional development in the schools, but also the development of a lot of new schools. This was the time of Renaissance 2010 with the goal of creating 100 new schools in 10 years. And it also was the time of closing a lot of schools, so a lot of changing of which schools were actually in the district, diversifying the portfolio of the district, I'd say. Also a growth in the number of charter schools during this time. Now, there are 4 key findings in the report, and we're going to talk a little bit about each one of them and kind of go into some details that didn't come out so much in the press. We find that the big positive finding from this report is that the high schools, we have a huge increase in graduation rates without a decline in academic performance. While in the elementary grades, math scores improved moderately. We'll talk about that, while reading scores were flat. Racial gaps in achievement have steadily increased over this entire period. And really importantly, the publicly reported statistics that are out there are just not accurate measures of progress. Now, the headlines that came out in the newspapers when we released this report really focused on the lack of improvement in the schools. And we found this misleading because yes, there was a lack of improvement in some areas, but huge improvement in other areas. But more importantly, those headlines missed the fact that there were huge improvements in some schools and no improvements in other schools, or even some schools fell behind. So overall, there's a lack of progress. But it doesn't mean that nothing was going on in the school system at the time. In fact, a lot of the reforms had very dramatic effects on kids. But you have reforms of each era piled on top of each other, conflicting with each other sometimes. Some of them may have positive effects, others negative effects. A lot of times the same policy will have some positive effects and some adverse effects. And so altogether, it gets really hard to say what's happened, and then it sometimes looks like nothing has changed when a lot has changed. Just the aggregate effect doesn't look like anything has changed. So that's why it's really important to know what happened and to whom it happened and why it happened. That way we can actually build on the successes, right? And we can learn from the lessons of the past, not keep repeating the same things over and over again that didn't work in the first place. Because everyone's been using inaccurate statistics for so many years, there's really been a false impression of what's going on in the district. So we really want to get it out there in terms of what's really happened so we can have a real conversation about what needs to happen moving forward, right? So we're going to talk about some of the details associated with each of these 4 main findings and some of the questions that raises for how we think about school practice moving forward. Okay, so this is our big positive, finding. The high schools, more students are graduating without a decline in academic performance. This works. So if we look back at students who entered CPS high schools back in 1992, and I think you guys have copies of the presentation in your folder, so you might be able to see it a little better. If we look at students who entered CPS high schools in the fall of 1992, who should have graduated by 1996, about 40% graduated 4 years later in 1996, and about 40% had dropped out. So these kids who entered high school in 1992 were about as likely to drop out as to graduate 4 years later, right? An additional about 10% of students had left the school system, and an additional 10% were still in the high schools in a 5th year of high school, right? So these 4 numbers here add up to 100%. Now when we calculate graduation rates, we don't include students who have left the system, right? So if we take these students out of the denominator, we end up with a graduation rate of 46% for that 1992 freshman cohort, okay? These points are right on top of each other, and then they just split apart, right? So we start off with students as likely to drop out as they are to graduate. We end up with students twice as likely to graduate as they are to drop out. That's an amazing change for the school district, and that's an amazing change for thousands of kids, right, whose life chances are improved because they actually made it through high school. Now we end up with a 4-year graduation rate of 65%. That's higher than the graduation rate that's reported by the school district. And you may wonder why. When you calculate graduation or dropout rates, you have to make 100 different decisions about who you're going to include as a CPS student, who you're going to include as a first-time 9th grader, how you're going to code students who left the system, transferred, when their transfer was validated. There are a million different decisions that you have to make. Now, the school district is interested in accountability, and they have, in general, they tend to make decisions that are extremely conservative, so that if a student could possibly be counted as a CPS student or could possibly be counted as a dropout, they get counted that way, right? And that's a way of making sure that there's no way to slip by, right? But that doesn't actually produce the most accurate statistic, right? It produces a very conservative statistic. But a lot of, it ends up probably being way more conservative than actually is represented by reality. So we come up with a 65% because we don't have to worry about accountability, right? Okay. Big change in graduation rates. So you may wonder why. Certainly, there were a lot of changes that happened in the school district during this time. One thing that happened is in 1997, there were new graduation requirements that were put into place, so all students had to take a college preparatory curriculum. They had to take 3 years of laboratory science. They had to take 3 years of math, 4 years of English, 2 years foreign language. So the requirements went way up. And if you see, you see this kind of moving apart and they split back together, that happens in 1997. And that's because of that policy. But around 1997 and 1996, that was also the time when students had to pass a promotional standard to move into 9th grade. So the lowest achieving students were not getting into high school at this time. And and we have this in the report, and we don't have all the charts here, but if you make adjustments for all of that, you'll see that graduation rates were actually lower than they should have been. Or actually, they're higher just because a lot of the very lowest achieving kids were not getting into high school, right? And that's sustained. So some of this improvement was due to the fact that low achieving kids are not necessarily making it into 9th grade anymore. Of course, when they make it into 9th grade, they're older. So you have more and more students who are coming into 9th grade at age 15, at age 16. That means they have to stay in school until they're 19 or 20 if they want to graduate. Most kids don't do that. So that also makes them more likely to drop out. So that had a depressing effect on graduation rates, which you can't necessarily see here, but you can kind of see in some of our other work. Whenever you have even once you adjust for, even if you consider the change in who's entering the schools and their achievement levels and their age, the increase in graduation rates is still really large. There's really just kind of a reset that happens with the change in graduation requirements. So it lowers and then it goes back up. So there's still these dramatic improvements in graduation rates that can't be accounted for by who is entering the high schools. So then the question may be, well, did the standards get lower? Are we expecting less of kids? I already told you that graduation requirements have been increased. If we look at ACT scores, we also see that ACT scores did not go down, even though many more students are actually making it to 11th grade. Right? You might think, oh, if more students are getting through, you're getting more of your weaker students through, to 11th grade and to graduate. That's going to have a depressing effect on your ACT scores. That didn't happen. And in fact, ACT scores have gone up. If we look from 2001, when students in Chicago schools started taking the ACT, to 2009, they've gone up from about a 16.2 to about a 17.2. So by about a point. At the same time, there's been no change in entering Explore scores. This is the test that students take at the beginning of the 9th grade year. So kids entering scores starting in 2005 have remained the same. And you'll see by other tests, they've also remained the same. Their ACT scores have been going up. I would not say that standards have been falling, right? If anything, they've been going up because we have more kids graduating, more kids taking the ACT and actually doing better on it. And it's not because they're coming in with better achievement in elementary school. It's because the high schools are doing something more. And on top of that, what you don't see in here is that college going rates are going up in CPS high schools. 9th grade on track rates are going up in CPS high schools. Pretty much every indicator we look at for high schools has been going up over the last few years. There's also been a huge increase in data use in the high schools. So high schools now get post-secondary tracking reports on all of their students. They know how they're doing in college. They get reports about their preparation for college. Students are plan your future, figuring out how they're going to succeed in college. There's 9th grade watch lists and success reports so that schools can actually monitor how kids are doing throughout the 9th grade year and see if they're on track for graduation and can get together around data. There's been a lot of data use in the high schools to really try to target kids and support them in graduating and getting ready for college. And a lot of that happened in Era 3 when we also see a lot of progress in the high schools. Okay. Now, another question that comes out whenever I show this, though, is this enough, right? We've had a 1-point increase from 2001 to 2009 in students' ACT scores. Now, students come in at a 14. On average, by their junior year, at the end of their junior year, they're at a 17. So on average, kids are gaining 1 point on the ACT EPASS system each year, right? 1 point each year. So this is a difference in 1 year of learning, right? As if they've had a whole additional year of learning. From that perspective, it's a lot, right? It seems like a lot. On the other hand, they're at a 17. ACT's college-ready benchmark is a 21. CPS's own goal is to reach a 20, right? At this rate, if schools keep improving at this rate, it's going to be 17 years until the school district reaches its goal of an average ACT score of 20. Okay. If kids are coming in at 14 and we want them to end up at a 20, that means they have to gain 2 points per year, not 1 point per year. Well, the average student nationwide gains about a point a year. So that means in Chicago schools, our kids have to show twice as much learning, have to learn at a rate that's twice as fast as kids in the rest of the country if they're going to make a 20. Is that a reasonable goal? Okay, how are we going to get them there? Obviously, something has to happen before high school. So let's talk about what's happened in the elementary schools.
All right, so this is the publicly reported elementary test score statistics that I'm sure you're familiar with. Starts off with, well, I should say that from 1990 until 2005, the ITBS was administered, and then from 2006 to 2009, the ISAT. And the benchmarks that were used for these statistics are percent at or above national norms for the ITBS and percent meeting Illinois learning standards for the ISAT. And using these benchmarks went from about 22% back in 1990 up to 65% in 2009. So we look at that and we say, wow, yay. That's great, isn't it? Well, unfortunately, it's not. After we adjust for changes in the test, changes in policy, changes in demographics, we see a different story. So here is the reading test scores that we calculate. These are average scores that include all students. And we organize them by age. So you can see that this is the 9-year-olds line for that whole period here. Okay. Basically, everything is pretty flat. Does not agree with what we saw in the previous slide. Okay. There are some improvements here. Oh, I'm not even talking to the mic. See, I told you I couldn't do it. But anybody having trouble hearing me? Yeah, oh, the tape, right. Okay, I'll try harder. Now, you see there are some improvements here in the lower years, but we don't know if this is really important because, see here in 1998 there's a jump up. If this represents actual increase in learning, then you would expect this group of students in subsequent years also to be higher than other years too, right? So these kids who were 9 years old in 1998, 10 years old in 1999, it looks like they're just about the same as before. What happened to this jump up here, right? And then it would be here, they're just about the same. So we don't think really that this is necessarily indicative of actual increased learning. Now, we can look at the ISAT scores here. You can see there's lots of improvement in ISAT scores. We have reason to suspect these as well. Now, we have item level data to equate the ITBS and to put the ITBS and the ISAT on the same scale, but unfortunately, we don't get item level data for the ISAT from the state. So we can't verify really the patterns in these scores. And we have reasons to suspect this. For one thing, the Explore scores that Elaine just showed you are flat. NAEP scores are also flat. And we know that there are problems with the scoring of the ISAT in that it takes fewer correct answers to get the same scale score in subsequent years. So we have reasons to think that perhaps patterns like this are not really meaningful. Okay? And you might also think, I mean, these are reading scores, right? There was a tremendous investment in literacy programs and reading curriculum during this time. So what happened to all that? I think that the reason for this is that, as we pointed out in our book, Organizing Schools for Improvement, that merely implementing curriculum changes and instructional programs without developing the 5 essential supports is not enough to actually bring about effective change in the schools. Okay. Now let's look at the math. Okay. Math looks a little bit better, but we've called these modest improvements. We said the reading is basically flat, and we say in math there is modest improvements. Okay. In particular, let me see. Hold on. Here we go. Now, if we look at the scores for 12-year-olds in 2001, they're about the same level as 13-year-olds in 1992. So that means that for these kids, their achievement level increased by basically 1 whole year during this time period, right? That's pretty good, isn't it? 1 year is a lot. However, if we look at this 1 year of improvement compared to the overall distribution of test scores within a grade, it's sort of modest. It's not so impressive. There's a tremendous variation in test scores within each grade. And in addition, for 12-year-olds here, their achievement level went from just above meets to sort of low middle meets on the ISAT learning scale. So they're still not really up where we would like them to be. Now let's see. Okay. Now we see this improvements in math scores, especially in Era 2 during the Vallis years, where there was a great emphasis on test-based accountability. And looking at these scores, you might think that that policy was successful. However, if this really represents increased learning, we would expect the increase in lower grades to be carried on to the upper grades as well. But unfortunately, as you can see, this is one cohort of kids here, right? If the learning was increasing every year, you would expect this line to be concave up, right? Representing acceleration in learning. But it's not, it's just flat.
Straight.
Okay. This
Straight.
pattern here is consistent with, what?
Straight.
Straight, right. This pattern is consistent with increased test prep and increased test accountability, or higher stakes associated with increased test accountability. Okay? And in addition, there was increased number of kids retained during this period that was intended to be promoting student achievement, increasing student achievement, but we think that it was, the primary effect there was to increase teaching to the test. Okay? Wrong button. Okay.
Actually, the retention policy had a lot of different effects, and we can talk about that.
Yeah.
There were some positives and some negatives,
Mhm.
not just teaching to the test. But certainly,
Right.
there was a lot of emphasis on teaching to the test
Right.
as a result.
But the important
The
thing is that
high
there are a
stakes.
lot of, for every policy that the school system puts into effect, there are many consequences, some of them unintended. Okay, so also it's very striking in this picture is the drop-off in test scores between 2005 and 2006. We worried about this for a while and checked it every which way. And we came to the conclusion that this was, in fact, real. And it was mainly due to the effect of narrowly teaching to the ITBS. Okay? And we can see here, let's focus on the graph on the left here, which is shows cohorts of kids starting out at age 9 in 2003. The graph on the left shows students in high-performing schools. And we can see that between 2005 and 2006, all students in the high-performing schools showed increases in their test scores, even the students in the lowest quintile. These are the lowest quintile students. These are the highest quintile students, right? Even the students in the lowest quintile started out at the lowest point, means way down here, right? Made improvements even though there was this disruptive change in the test. Now, if we look at the similar graph for low-performing schools, even the high-achieving students, the students that started out in 2003 in the highest quintile, these students made no improvement at all when the test changed. Okay? So we believe that this is due to narrowly teaching to the ITBS, getting students familiar with the format and the content of the ITBS, rather than actually teaching the students skills that they need to succeed. And then when the test changed, the students were thrown for a loop. Okay? And there were other consequences of this that had effects on the racial achievement gap, and Paul is going to talk about that.
All right, so most of you will remember that the racial achievement gap received a lot of negative attention in the press. You know, racial gaps are increasing across the district. Now, while that's true, you know, one of the reasons is that scores for Asian and white students were actually increasing across the period, okay? So we see here that scores for Asians and whites increased from 1990 to 2009 by about 10 points. And this is equivalent to about 1 year's worth of learning. All right, we also show in the full report that their math scores increased by about 18 points across the same period. Okay, these are reading scores. Now, it's important to recognize that, that these improvements are concentrated in high-performing schools that you know, serve primarily white and Asian students and are located generally on the north side. Okay, the issue here, and the issue picked up by the press, was that scores for African American students are flat. There's a different pattern here. You know, there's no improvement in African American scores from 1990 to 2005. And we see a dramatic drop in scores in 2006. Okay? Now, Stuart already explained this drop with the graph that showed that students in low-performing schools seemed to show no gains with the test change to ISAT. Okay? So we know that African American students are concentrated in these low-performing schools. And you know, these low-performing schools are under a great deal of pressure to meet testing standards and are thus narrowly teaching to the test instead of emphasizing reading and math skills. Okay? But again, it wasn't just with the ISAT. Racial gaps have been increasing even before the implementation of the new test, okay? We see that here, all the way to here, right, 2005. There's a widening, okay? And we also show, again, in the full report, that low-performing schools in Era 3 improved the least. So that is to say that schools that needed the most improvement actually improved the least in Era 3. You want to talk more about that?
Yeah, I'll talk a little bit more about that. So we have, you know, Era 2. Era 2 was actually the time, and in the report we say this was the most equitable time because this is the time when we actually saw that schools that started out the lowest performing were just about as likely to improve as schools that started out the highest performing. In the other eras, the schools that started out high performing were more likely to improve than other schools. On the other hand, as Stuart just showed you, there's a lot of evidence that a lot of that improvement was actually just very narrowly teaching to the test, teaching to the ITBS, instead of teaching more general skills, generally teaching math and reading in a way that would be transferable across tests, right? Era 3 was a time when really the lowest performing schools really improved the least and where there was really this widening of the racial gap. But at the same time, this was a time when there was tremendous activity targeting the lowest performing schools in the district. I mean, I think the district really was passionate about improving education for kids at the lowest performing schools. There's a lot of investment in reading curriculum and math curriculum. A lot of the poorest performing schools were closed. You know, let's get rid of these schools that aren't serving kids. Many new schools were opened, you know, a lot of times really targeting the neighborhoods that had the poorest performing schools. And then, again, a lot of pressure on the tests. Let's make sure that the kids are actually learning. But, we don't see the benefit of all that here, which, makes us wonder, what we need to do going forward. We know from a lot of our past research that the schools that really are successful in sustained improvement over time are the schools where adults are really working together cooperatively. The adults, the parents, the teachers, the school leadership are working together cooperatively, focused on school climate and instruction. So we have to ask what's happened to the schools over this period. Now, we're not going to go into all the details of what's happened. It's in the full long report if you want to go find it online. But one thing that really struck us when we looked at what was actually happening inside of schools was the fact that students' engagement in their classes has actually been flat. Now, by engagement, we mean the degree to which kids are actually coming to class, participating, interested in what's going on, really getting involved in the work in the class.
And challenged.
Yeah. Well, that's right, where they say that the topics they're studying are interesting and challenging. They don't get bored. They really, work hard to do their best in their classes. There's a little bit of an uptick here in 1997 at a time when there was, stability in the district for the first time in years and lots of investment in infrastructure. But, pretty much the levels are, they've gone kind of up and down, but they're pretty much the same. Now, we know from our work that engagement in classes is very strongly associated with the grades that students get, and that this is actually what matters for students' outcomes much more than their test scores. The degree to which they're working hard and they're learning how to be learners. That's what matters for college success. That's what matters later on for earnings in the workforce. So the fact that this has been flat makes us really wonder, what needs to happen so that we're really building strong schools that get kids engaged as learners in their classroom. Now our final big topic from the report. Do you want me to talk about it or you want to talk about it?
I'm going to talk about the beginning. Clicker. All right, now people are very fond of beating on the ISAT these days. They say it's a bad test, the standards are too low, there are all kinds of problems with it. But they say that soon we'll have new tests that use the Common Core standards, and we'll have higher standards instead of the these low standards that we have now that are not geared towards college readiness. So you think that will fix everything? Paul?
Absolutely not, Stuart.
Thank you. Actually, I don't think that the ISAT is such a bad test, but I really don't know. But I have no reason to think that it's a bad test. But the big problem is the way that the results are used. Using benchmark statistics, that is what I mentioned before, the percent meeting or exceeding standards, is not a good way to track progress over time. Okay? So, oh yeah, Elaine is going to do
I'm going to
this.
do this one. Go ahead and click it through though.
Oh, click there?
Yeah,
Okay.
just real quick. So this is a chart. I don't know how many of you feel familiar with this kind of chart, but it just shows you where most students are in terms of their ISAT scores down around here. So the average scores for 14-year-olds is right around at this point here, which is what, 250 or so. Let's throw up the ISAT or the state standards on here. So you've got about 2/3 of students, about 68% of students that are meeting ISAT standards. That's all these students here between these two lines. And then these students here that are exceeding standards, right? This tail right here. And then everyone here is below state standards, right? So you see you've got a hump that's just above the meet standards point, right? So a lot of kids are just getting over that meet standards point. So there's been a lot of criticism about this benchmark, saying we have the wrong benchmark, right? And it's really true. Can you click? The fact is, this benchmark is about 40 points away from the college ready standards, which is actually the exceeds benchmark. The exceeds point. The exceeds point actually corresponds exactly with ACT's benchmark for the Explore test for college readiness standards. So kids are about 40, if you're just meeting standards, you're about 40 points away from being at college ready standards. Kids gain on average 10 points a year. So the average kid is 40 points away, 4 years of learning away from where they need to be. Obviously, it's too low if we're aiming, if 90% of our kids want to go to college and get a 4-year college degree. So what's the solution? Should we put it up here at exceeds? If we do that, now 85% of our kids are failing, right? And 75% of the kids in the state of Illinois would be failing, right? If we put it up here, we're putting it at a standard that no school, except the most highly advantaged schools in the system, no typical school in the system could meet or has ever met ever, right? So the typical school in Illinois, typical non-low income school in Illinois would have about a quarter of its students actually meeting the standard. So you can put the standard at a place where nobody can make it, right? Just to have it be meaning, but then we're just gonna say all of our schools are failing. And the schools that have all these kids down here that have no way of making the standard, because they have no way of making the standard, how do you think they're going to change their practice to try to make that standard? Since we don't know how to do it in terms of learning, all it's going to do is encourage more of that teaching to the test and, frankly, cheating, right? So this is not a good standard. This is not a good standard. Should we put it somewhere in between? Maybe we should put it, right at the, at the 50th percentile point, right, where the typical kid is. So then you put your standard at a place that's average, and by definition, 50% of students will fail, right? Because you put it at the median, at the 50th percentile. Now, does it mean anything? No. Does it mean anything that 50% of the students would be failing? No. You just put it at the point where 50% of the students would fail. So there is no good place to put a benchmark, right? There's not going to be a solution in terms of figuring out where the benchmark should go. Beyond that, you put your benchmark here or here, it doesn't matter. If you put it here, doesn't matter what happens to the growth of all these kids because it doesn't get counted in the statistic, right? The statistic only counts what's happening to the, how many kids are getting over that benchmark. So schools that have a lot of kids down here who are far away from the benchmark, or a lot of kids up here who are far away from the benchmark, they could show immense progress and it won't look like they're improving because they don't have many kids to get over that benchmark. While schools that have a lot of kids right here, they could show a little bit of progress and suddenly it looks like they've made amazing gains. Stuart's going to go into more detail on that.
Okay, here's, this shows distribution of scores for 2 years for, say, one school. Okay, 1 year it's this, the next year it's this. This is the benchmark here at 280. This school has made an average 15-point increase in average score, which is really good, right? 15 points is great. Since 10 points is the average, this school is making about 50% greater than average, okay? And because the average score for these kids is near the benchmark, we see 10.6 percentage point increase in the percent of kids, in the number of kids meeting the benchmarks, okay? So this is similar to the situation in several, a large number of elementary schools in Chicago, where the mean is close to the meets point, okay? Now let's look at this. Here we've got the same distribution of scores, the same 15% increase, but in this case, we have put the benchmark over here. This is similar to what would happen if we put the benchmark at the exceeds line, okay, at the exceeds point, which is considerably higher than where most of the students are. Keep in mind, same 15% increase, or same 15-point increase, but here the change in the number of kids meeting the benchmark is only 2 percentage points. Okay. Now this is what would happen if we put the or similar to what would happen if we put the benchmark at the exceeds point, right? This is also similar to what we see in the high schools, because the meets line for high schools for the PSAE is very high relative to where most of the students are. Only 25% of the students in Chicago meet standards in high school because the standards are so high. And in the past, we have seen very, very little change in the percentage of students meeting the high school benchmark. And people have said, well, they look at this and they say, the high school students are not improving at all. Now, this is in contrast to what we saw before, where the ACT scores are steadily increasing. The reason for this disjoint is the relative location of the most of the students and the benchmark. Benchmark is much higher than where most of the students are, so that even a large increase in the average score will appear to be a very small improvement in terms of the change in the percentage of kids meeting the benchmark.
Okay. Okay, so that's it. Here's our 4 findings again. Don't need it. We tried to move beyond the simplistic nothing worked headline to show that there actually have been a lot of changes in the school district over time, but it's not a simple story. And it's also not a simple story of this policy worked and this policy didn't, because of course they all interact with each other. And they can have both beneficial and adverse consequences. And we can talk some more about that in the discussion period if you want to. In fact, the next panel is going to be talking about what are the plans for the schools moving forward. And so we really want to think about what this all means for the school system moving forward. Again, we've said that our research over and over again shows that what really matters for schools is getting the adults working together collaboratively, focused on instruction and the learning climate. So we really want to think, what are the implications for building strong schools in Chicago moving forward? Al. It's all you.
Well, it's all us. I have a number of questions. I will begin with one that I find particularly unsettling, and that's why I chose it first. And that is this increasing racial gap in achievement that has been the one constant over each of the 3 eras. And so this question gets to this in this way. It says, should we pay attention more to improving reducing the racial gap by focusing on test scores or grade point average? This goes back to the accountability issue and on track. So if you could speak to that, that'd be helpful.
I'll speak to that, and then I'm sure there are people in the audience that want to speak to that, because we also have a huge GPA gap. A huge racial gap in GPA, which is even more disturbing because GPA is what really predicts whether kids are going to go to college, graduate from college, get high earnings in the workforce. And GPA, as I said, is really determined by students' engagement in their classes. And one thing I do worry about, we know that kids don't like test prep. We know that our most poorly performing schools are spending a month or more just taking practice tests, right? What's that doing for kids' engagement, and what's it doing for their deep learning, that's transferable to other places? Certainly, we want to hold schools to some standards and make sure they're teaching the skills that kids need, and that was the whole point of having these accountability tests in the first place. But at what point does that go too far and result in negative, problems for learning? Do other people want to just comment?
As the
real quick?
person that asked that question, did you have a sense of where we should be going when you asked the question?
I think the focus should be on grade point average. I think what we're looking at is that it's so capricious, this issue of benchmarking and comparison of achievement through standard assessments. Even ACT is saying, no, there are no predictors in terms of college readiness and college completion, and they're going the non-cognitive way. And so I think we really have to pay attention to what's happening every single day in instruction, in what children are experiencing every single day in terms of how they're being engaged in learning, and demystifying their own achievement and creating beings that are engaging and understanding themselves as intellectual beings as a means for them accessing their education. And we're not doing that. We're focusing on everything else but what actually happens in the classroom, what's happening to children. And I think that paradigm and that dialogue has to start shifting.
Over there? Yeah.
I don't think we're ever going to get student engagement unless we deal with the issues of teacher engagement and the fact that this is a very non-engaging time for teachers. So in my mind, those two things really go together.
Do you want to expand on
Yeah.
that and say what you mean by a non-engaging time for teachers?
It's not a good time for teachers. They're constantly being bashed. There is not an attention to their professional capabilities. They're developed and then they can't use them. So I think we have I'm a mother of a young teacher, and I remember my own teaching, and I think that things act against their engagement, and if they are not engaged, their students are not going to be engaged.
And so we have, yet again, the complexity of it, but I'm not thrilled. I mean, we shouldn't do test, we should do GPA, but there is a reality here that we have to deal with, and that is test won't go away. And so as an accountability piece, I think maybe not today, but we have to think about, well, how do we feed them in? Because just GPA is never going to work, especially when the data suggests that there's a wide gap in GPA as well. So it's not like one indicator is one place and another indicator is another. So we have to kind of figure out this issue. Part of this question goes to who's in and who's out of your analysis. And the subtext of it is, there are two pieces. One, what do we know about the effect of these scores, data, on charter school expansion? And two, did you include charter schools in your analysis?
Yep. Do you want to talk about it, or you want me to?
Yeah, we include data from charter schools where we have data. I think we have data for all charter schools, so very few that don't provide us with data. And we did not study charter schools specifically, so we didn't separate them out, so we really can't say anything about that.
We have data, everything that we presented, we have data for all the charter schools. The only thing we don't have for charter schools are grades, students' grades, and transcripts, and
That's
yeah.
it.
And so we didn't include, and attendance, which we didn't include. Yeah. Oh, and yeah, and
Oh,
that's
that's
an
right.
important thing. In fact, I meant to mention that, so I'm glad you said that. You know, one question that we got was whether, actually, people have been asking about a lot of different policies, which we'd be happy to talk about. One question was whether the graduation rates have improved because of all the new schools, and that we have a lot of new charter schools that have better graduation rates than a lot of the neighborhood schools. And so we looked to see whether, the improvement was a result of having new schools that were serving kids better, or whether the schools that were around are actually serving their own kids better over time. And we found that it was actually the schools that have been around are serving their own kids better over time. That even when we take out all new schools, we still see a dramatic increase in graduation rates among the schools that have been in existence this entire period.
Stuart, I'm going to ask you this question. You said to us, everything we know is unreliable. I mean, essentially, you said all the publicly reported data, we just shouldn't pay attention to it. Well, if I'm a school person, what do I need? What data do I need? And this question asks, what are the kind of things that schools need that can help them with their accountability?
I'm glad you asked that, Al.
I thought you would be.
I was hoping somebody would ask that. Right. So we spent, 4 slides talking about how benchmarks are no good, but we did not really say anything about what would be better, right? I have always advocated using average scores because they include the results from every student in the school instead of just focusing on the kids that are near the benchmark. Average scores would include everything, and the way that that this could be displayed is by putting a range of scores and the range of skills, the types of skills that students can be expected to perform at each average score level. So I think this would be much more informative to people than just saying, 50% of the kids met standards, because most people do not know what meeting standards are. Meeting standards, could be completely arbitrary. But if we had examples of the kind of tasks that students could perform at each average score level, then I think this would be much more informative to people.
Can I?
Yeah.
Also gains. I mean, gains would
And
be very
gains,
useful.
that's right.
Value added growth is really what
Yes.
we need to know then, because that's
Paul, go ahead.
learning.
Then I'm going to ask some teachers or principals in the school how they felt about that response.
And just
Go ahead.
just to add to what Stuart and Elaine are saying, not only are benchmarks not such a great marker for progress, but to use them to track scores over time, as Stuart was alluding to, it's misappropriate. It's not appropriate. That's not how that I think that statistic was meant to be used. Now, an alternative besides average scores would be looking at the 5 essentials. Work that the consortium has done that shows that building schools in these ways, building these fundamental supports, leads to improved learning and improved outcomes in schools.
Not only that, but there are also non-academic outcomes that we can look at, like Paul just mentioned, our 5 essential supports, and then there are other student-level non-academic outcomes that are very good. I happen to become a fan recently of grit and perseverance.
No,
she's
okay,
getting old.
let's not go there. 'cause
Okay,
we have other
let's,
research that's going
in
on.
fact, let me regain control. And ask, are there any school people,
predictive of
teachers,
anything.
principals, that kind of
No.
role here? Because I think it's always important to kind of talk about what we think in relationship to what, I almost said real people, I didn't mean it that way. What people do who are in real schools. And so the ability to kind of implement the way we think things should be handled with what it means to be on the ground level. And so I think that's a part of the conversation you want to take with you as you leave about how does this play off. I have another question about the achievement gap, and that is, are scores or results for African American students in high-performing schools also flat?
Schools, did we look at this?
I don't think we looked at that.
I don't think we looked at
Okay,
That's a.
That's a
We-
good
we
good
can look at
question.
that, I would
We
imagine.
can
I
do
think
that,
we should
yes.
look at that.
I think that would be very helpful. In fact, I should say that there are some, the panel will be available for clarification questions after this report.
Yeah.
Go ahead,
Right, and
Elaine.
we can type answers to any questions that don't get answered here. We will be happy to answer online.
We have time for one more question, and that is, what were the positive and negative effects of the promotion retention policy?
Yeah. Now, Melissa Roderick and Jenny Nagaoka are here, and they're really the experts here in it. Do you want me to give a quick summary, or do you guys want to talk about it? I'll give a real quick summary. So many different effects of the promotion policy. Some good effects, certainly it encouraged schools to pay more attention to the low-performing kids. They felt much more supported by their teachers and by their parents. It encouraged teachers to teach grade-level material, so we don't have 5th grade math being taught over and over again in 6th and 7th and 8th grade. However, it did encourage a narrowing of the curriculum, so less time spent on non-tested subjects meant a lot more time spent on test prep. High-achieving kids who were already above the standards felt like they were having less pressure to succeed. For the kids that, so the benefits, any benefits actually accrued to kids before anybody was retained in terms of having more, more support for low-performing kids and teaching actually grade-level material. For the kids who actually were retained, though there wasn't any benefit of actually repeating a year, they didn't learn more in that repeated year than they would have learned if they moved on, and it also made them old for grade, which then made them more likely to eventually drop out of school. So.
And that's what you get after working for 15 years.
Yes.
Very, very good, Elaine. We're going to stop this part of our morning and shift to the panel discussion. So I'd like to thank our authors for their presentation. They will be back with us, but I want to thank them for their presentation. We are now going to have a panel discussion with two individuals who have deep and rich knowledge and experiences of the topics that we're talking about. I won't introduce them with any lengthy kind of introduction. They're both very nice people. And if you want to know more about them, feel free to do so. But panelist Marty Gartzman and Jennifer Cheatham will be kind of guiding us through this discussion. But I'm going to frame the questions that they will answer. And then as you're listening to their answers, I really do, after we go through this conversation, I want us to have a more pressured conversation. Because if the one thing that we do know is that one of the long-held beliefs that we have carried forward is that change takes time. We can't accept that anymore. We cannot accept that change takes time. And so in that sense of urgency, that's how we will have this conversation. And so I open this question, and whoever wants to start first can feel free to start first. But the first one, what are the new challenges and opportunities we have to improve instruction and specifically address the kind of Common Core state standards and the new assessments?
The question is designed to look forward, but I think what I want to do is start by looking a little bit backwards at the three areas, because I think there's lots of parallels in those three areas with the challenges that Jen and the CPS team now are confronted with, and try to characterize what was happening in the world of supporting mathematics over those three eras very quickly. In era one, it's much like today in that it came on the heels of the release of some new groundbreaking standards. Then it was the NCTM curriculum and evaluation standards for school mathematics. These then defined the state standards. They defined, not only in Illinois, but they kind of led to the development of standards in other areas. They were really groundbreaking at the time. And the big focus nationally and in Chicago was how you translate those standards into some sort of classroom reality, much like the discussions that are going on now. There was lots of national funding at the time to support those efforts. However, there wasn't much central office support. All of the central office people had been, essentially the central office had been gutted. And it was not clear that they would have been capable to address those issues at the time anyhow. So almost all of the support that schools received during that time for supporting mathematics came from external partners. Oftentimes it was universities. There was a big entity called the Teachers Academy of Math and Science that was developed by school reformers specifically to support mathematics and science improvement. But it was all coming from external partners. And if you were in a school that was able to hook up with one of those external partners, you tended to do reasonably well. Okay, if you were not one of the lucky schools that hooked up with an external partner, you tended not to do particularly well. So there was a great unevenness in the kinds of mathematics support that happened. In addition, the big decision, of course, around curriculum and instruction with the 1988 reform was that it was all site-based decision-making about curriculum and instruction. Not a huge land shift from where it was, but it came with all sorts of funding, and really all decisions now, from there on forward to this day, have been bounded by this site-based decision, decision-making around curriculum instruction. So that set the landscape in mathematics and science improvement really for the next 20 years. So era one, new standards, local decisions about curriculum instruction, and then support largely through external partners. Era 2 continued with the idea to try to align instruction with standards, and still with a lot of support from external partners, but with a big NSF grant, National Science Foundation grant to the district, there was kind of the emergence of a district support team in mathematics and science that didn't exist before. But with lots of different manifestations of what math programs look like, lots of different textbooks being used, et cetera, kind of an explosion of local autonomy made it almost impossible for the district to provide any kind of coherent model for instruction. So they relied on really generic strategies around what are best practices and what are the standards and alignment to standards and things of that nature. And that kind of work tends to fall in what I call feel-good strategies. That is, they make the people who are providing the support feel like they're doing something, but they tend to be really ineffective and don't really do much to change the needle on instruction. In addition, in Era 2, there was this huge disconnect between the accountability system and the standards-based reform efforts. Okay. Within the elementary schools, the accountability mechanism was all based around the Iowa Test of Basic Skills, which really reflected a back-to-basics kind of computation-based view of the teaching and learning of mathematics, and totally contradicted what was trying to happen with what the standards-based reformers were trying to do. At the high school level, there were the increased graduation requirements that Elaine mentioned, and there were some pretty good course frameworks and, that were developed for all the courses in mathematics. And there were also the, citywide exams were also used as an attempt to kind of move the needle forward on instruction and through a kind of an accountability mechanisms. These were the famous case exams, and they tended to be poorly developed. They were developed locally. They tended to be not very good. They weren't used in any kind of reasonable way. No one learned anything from the case exams. They were just used to kind of rank schools from top to bottom, which could have been done without those exams. And they were kind of unceremoniously dropped later on in Era 3. But again, it was locally developed tests there was no real structure or support system or vision for how you move high schools forward. So again, it was generic approaches to school improvement in Era 2, these feel-good strategies around alignment to standards. Teachers spent hours and hours and hours aligning their lessons to not only state standards, but locally developed CPS standards. There was a disconnect between the standards-based reforms and the accountability expectations, and those were kind of key characteristics of that era. In the third area, and that's the era where I was involved with, there was an attempt to promote more coherence about mathematics support. This was actually largely perceived to be around narrowing of instructional materials choices. But the idea really wasn't about instructional materials. The instructional material choices were a way, and maybe the easiest way that we could think of at the time, to try to get our arms around how you align a whole system of instruction. That is, how you align professional development, make it close to what teachers are doing in the classroom, how you deal with coaching, formative assessments. So there was lots of other support that was provided there, and largely they were aligned to the expectations that were embedded in those instructional materials that got a lot of attention. But it was much more about that. In the high school, the strategies were a little bit slower and harder to take root. They focused on students at risk, and later a lot of the elementary approaches were embedded in what was done in what was called the high school transformation program. And there's lots of lessons to be learned from this era. We did a lot of evaluation, but I'll focus on just a few. One is that even in a site-based environment where there's local decision-making about instructional issues, schools tended to respond very favorably to a district vision, particularly if it was coupled with lots of support. Okay. So the site-based decision-making around curriculum didn't have to be a restriction for doing good work. There were tremendous benefits to trying to have a little bit more aligned system in terms of standards, tools, assessment, accountability. And another lesson was the importance of having a clear, consistent, coherent message emanating from the central office through the areas to the schools. And when that happened, there were lots of good things that happened. And when it didn't happen, there was a lot of dissonance and confusion in the school. So in terms of challenges and opportunities, I guess I'll start with the opportunities. And one is a tremendous opportunity that the Common Core State Standards presents to encourage people in schools, teachers, principals, all stakeholders, to really reflect on their practice and what's going on, to kind of address the concerns that were raised earlier about focusing on what's important and going on in the classroom. So this is really a nice tool for being able to do that. And I think hope springs eternal when you get new leadership. It's it's refreshing now to hear the talk about support and not just about accountability. I think we're coming out of a really dark era during those years of the Huberman regime with regard to instruction, where there was no talk about instruction. I think people are now really open to this new discussion around how we improve teaching and learning in classrooms.
Some of us talked about instruction. Come on, Marty, you know this.
Okay, so I'm taking the average as the
I know,
consortium did.
All right.
Okay, and I think there's a lot of good work to build on. So I think those are opportunities. I think challenge number one is a capacity issue, and the Common Core standards create new challenges in terms of capacity because it's all about having teachers really understand the mathematics and what to do with that, and how do you enact a classroom that involves those mathematics. And it's not just the capacity of teachers and the capacity of schools, but it's the capacity of the whole system to think about how mathematics is supported. It's not just about how you can't hire and fire yourself out of this mess, okay? It really can't depend on just superstar teachers or principals. It's how you move the great bulk of teachers, principals, network personnel, to think about mathematics instruction a little bit differently. And it's about creating a culture that really says we got to learn from this. And that's not something that is a school system at large, not in individual pieces. Historically, we haven't done very well at. Alignment and coherence, another big challenge here. And it's not about instructional materials, it's about the way we support teachers, it's the way we support schools, it's about how we assess students, it's about how we evaluate schools and teachers and how we evaluate the networks. There needs to be this kind of clear, consistent, coherent message coming down about all those things. It has to be, it's how you create an aligned system that supports instruction. I think there are some challenges, and one of the big question marks is the new assessments. We don't know what the new assessments are going to look like. There's a lot of hope that they're going to be assessments that are worthy of being taught to. Okay? And there's a lot of work and energy going into that, but there's still a big question mark, a bit of a mystery. And of course, the big challenge of doing all this work is you have to do it now in an environment with limited personnel, with limited resources, and with a support infrastructure from the central office and really from the networks. It's been largely dismantled and is being rebuilt.
Jennifer?
All right. Hi, everybody. I'm going to take Marty's lead and respectfully ignore the question for a minute. But I promise I'll get to it. I would love to start by saying that as a graduate student studying education reform in urban districts, I was taught to know your context. So I really appreciate being here and having the opportunity to talk about what happened in these last 3 phases of reform in Chicago, because if we don't know our context, we end up making the mistakes that lots of urban districts make, which is to ignore the things that were working and trample all over them, to create new initiatives that just looks like the same old initiative that I did 10 or 15 years ago with a new name. We rearrange the deck chairs and change everybody's titles, but nothing actually changes for students in the classroom. So I think this is a great opportunity for us to talk about what we can do, building on the past, to actually change the experience that students have day to day in their classrooms. With that said, I brought a PowerPoint. What do you think of that, Marty? So this is in your packet. But I do want to pay some respect to the 3 eras very quickly. Most of you guys know that I've only been in CPS for 2.5 years, so I don't have the kind of institutional knowledge that many of you do. But I've talked with many of you and tried to piece together the story of what's happened in CPS. I also want to say that Peggy and Gudelia asked both of us to really speak to math and literacy. So I have my literacy hat on as well as my CPS hat. So in terms of the phases of reform and literacy, I'll just go over this really quickly, but it seems apparent that in that first phase of decentralization, this is when the LSCs came into being. It was all about site-based decision-making, and there was a focus on building infrastructure and focusing on school leadership, not just principal leadership, but the leadership of LSCs. But there were no district-wide goals and strategies that were really focused on instruction. It was a school-by-school decision. Into the next era, when it comes to literacy, there was some support happening for the lowest performing schools. And what was referred to in the presentation, some disparate support provided by a whole variety of intermediary organizations. And you were lucky if you got the support, and not so lucky if you didn't. I also want to say that this characterizes a lot of the reform efforts that were happening across the country during this era. I worked for an Annenberg-funded organization in San Francisco, the Bay Area School Reform Collaborative. And during that era, we worked school by school by school. And it was only until probably the early 2000s that we realized that we had to focus on the system. It wasn't a school-by-school reform effort, which is what we see happening even here in Chicago, some efforts to start thinking more systemically, but still pockets of support. We see the work of the Chicago Reading Initiative, again, focusing on the lowest performing schools in the city. There were some really interesting efforts related to literacy coaching, I think very well intentioned, but from what I've learned is that the quality of those literacy coaches there was a large range of quality across the system. And then, of course, we had some pockets of schools involved with Reading First at primary, Striving Readers, which was focused on intervention in the middle grades, and what's called IDS at the high school level. None of those things have taken hold, and you see some remnants of that work, but it hasn't been sustained necessarily. So now we're heading into this hopeful new era, which may be called, I don't know, the college readiness era. That's what we're obsessed with these days, which is a good thing. I think a lot of you have probably seen this slide. We use it a lot in CPS to talk about the future and the future of the Common Core state standards. And I think it actually reflects the conversation we had earlier about benchmarks, et cetera. But the Council of Great City Schools did an analysis to try to predict what would happen to test scores if we moved to the park tomorrow, which would be the new assessment in 2014-15 aligned to the Common Core state standards. And you can see we go from where we are now, about 68% at meets and exceeds on ISAT, down to about 19%. And interestingly, that reflects the percentage of students that are pretty much at exceeds on the ISAT, right? The benchmark has changed. Of course, we hope the assessment tool is better too. So let's talk about the real work for a minute, because this is more than about a test. I keep telling everyone in CPS, we are not moving to the Common Core state standards because of the park assessment that is looming in the distance. We're moving there because it better represents what we think instruction should look like, that will put students on the path to college and career readiness. So my guess is you've all studied the Common Core state standards very closely and read them many, many times. But let's do a little refresher. So this is an example of an Illinois standard, 7th grade. Identify the structure and format of text, including graphics and headers. This is a similar standard, but for the Common Core. Analyze the structure an author uses to organize text, including how the major sections contribute to the whole and to the development of ideas. I want you to just for 30 seconds turn to the person next to you and talk about the difference between those two standards. What do you see? Go ahead and talk. Okay. I'm not going to ask you to share out, but if this were a real class, I would call on you. Now I want to take this to the next level because standards are just standards. They don't mean anything until we translate them into the tasks that students are engaged in the classroom. The instructional core, which is what Elmore has named it, is the relationship between the teacher, the student, and the content, right? Which equals the task. So this is potentially the task that a student would be engaged in related to these standards. So task number 1 for 7th grade, students might read several different paragraphs and then decide on which of these text structures are being used. Do you guys remember doing this? I know I did when I was a kid. Multiple choice. We love multiple choice. I'm kidding, of course. On the right-hand side is another task. Students read a complex text and are asked to analyze the text structure, meaning the way that each paragraph contributes to the main argument, and describe why the author chose to organize the text in the way he or she did, including ways that the text might have been better organized. Talk to your partner for 30 seconds. What's the difference between these two tasks?
Good to have someone who cares about instruction thinking about these things and suggests.
It's fun, isn't it?
I'm really encouraged.
It's fun. I mean, to think about what's possible. All right, time's up. You see the difference? I hope so. We want to move towards experiences that are more similar to task number 2, although I don't think that this exactly represents where we want to go. The Common Core pushes us to think about how students apply multiple skills to tasks that are meaningful. Let that sink in. That's what this work is about. So that they're truly ready for college and career and life. I wanted to make one other point about the challenges and the opportunities, and that is about, in literacy, about text complexity. So one of the concepts that is embedded in the Common Core in each of the literacy, in each of the grades, is this idea that students should be engaged in thinking about reading and writing text, and that teachers should no longer be choosing text just because it's the text that was given them at their grade level, but they should be choosing text based on the students that are in front of them, which means that they need to know kind of mechanically the students' what's called their lexile level. So technically, what is their reading level? But they should also know the student and what is relevant to the student and what background knowledge they bring to the text. So some of these qualitative characteristics should help them choose the text. And this is a whole skill set that I don't think many of our teachers have. Not only do they not have access to the text that they need, but they don't necessarily have the skills to make great choices about which student in their classroom should be reading what text to stretch them to the next level, which is called the zone of proximal development for those education geeks in the audience. So a couple thoughts on what needs to be done differently. I love the comment earlier about the 5 E's, or the how do you describe the 5 E's? The context in which the learning happens in a school. So leadership, professional learning, et cetera. But I want to focus in on a few things. First of all, in CPS, in our best efforts, instruction has been textbook driven for a while now. So teachers, especially in our lowest performing schools, have been asked to follow the teacher's guide with fidelity. And this, I think, contributes to the lack of progress in literacy. So we need them to actually know how to plan standards-based instruction, which is not an easy thing. As a professional, though, you should know how to unpack standards, create performance assessments, plan units, plan lessons based on the children who are in front of you. This will be a major lift for our system. Secondly, we need to support teachers in identification of the appropriate text for their class and also for individual students or groups of students. We need to think seriously about what effective, formative, and summative performance assessment looks like. So what are those meaningful, authentic tasks that we want students to be engaged in? And then lastly, the standards are going to require that teachers have a level of content knowledge and expertise that some of them don't quite have. Some do, but some don't. So we really need to invest in our teachers and their content knowledge. And we also, there are going to be some instructional practices that are going to be critical, that every teacher has to know and be able to do extremely well. And these are just a few examples. And then in addition to this, this gets back to the 5 E's, that even around the classroom, we're going to have to fundamentally change the way that we do business. We're going to need to think differently about instructional materials, like how we even purchase textbooks. How do schools decide on what materials that they're purchasing? There's like a whole slew of work related to that. We need to be really smart about it. Professional learning. Teachers need more than just traditional professional development. They need ongoing one-on-one coaching, and they need quality time for collaboration. Collaboration time is going to be key if they're going to plan their instruction appropriately and make adjustments for individual students. The way we think about monitoring and accountability, this morning's conversation needs to change dramatically. Which includes not just the quantitative data that we collect, but the qualitative data that we collect. So what are principals and teacher leaders observing when they go into classrooms? The standards will change that. And then how do we talk to parents? How do we actually report student progress? That's going to change completely. The idea of what a grade is, if we're in a standards-based system, you get grades based on your mastery of standards, not on how many points you got on the last quiz. So, okay, it's a lot, but all right, cut me off.
Well, I'm not cutting you off, but I am going to continue with you in this way. And I'm going to ask all of us to think about this question as concretely as we can. You began to talk about changes, that what we need to do differently.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask you to spend just a few minutes talking about what we would do differently so that when Elaine and her colleagues report 20 years from now, they will have something very different to report as opposed to what we heard this morning. So what do we have to do differently? Clearly the opportunity is there, but as Terry said, there's no silver bullet here. So what do we have to do differently?
I
Jennifer?
think I actually just started getting into that. I know, but
Yeah.
do you want to? Oh, okay, I'll go to my last slide. This is the grand finale. So I think this is what we need to do differently. There are so many things I could list that we need to do differently, but one of the most important things is that in urban districts, we have a tendency to function in the following way. The central office comes up with the answer, and we kind of deliver the answer on high, and we ask everybody to go out and do what we say. There's this turnkey delivery system, especially in a really big district where we tell the network or the area teams, they go out and follow orders. That does not work. Why do we keep trying to function in this way? The way we want to function is in a system of really nested learning communities, where the central office is learning about not only its role in the district, it has a role. Sometimes we do other people's role, though. So learn what your role is and continually learn how to do it better. The network team, same thing. Let's get really clear on the function of the network team as support to schools, providing differentiated support, and they need to be continually learning. Same with school-level instructional leadership teams and, of course, teacher teams. What this particular chart gets at is exactly how we're working with the Common Core. which I could explain, but it follows that same pattern. At the central office, we are really investing in central office leaders as instructional leaders. Every Friday, all of the chiefs meet on Fridays to learn about the Common Core state standards and what it means, in addition to other things. The network teams meet once a month to learn about what the Common Core state standards could and should look like. All of the schools and the system right now, every instructional leadership team meets once a quarter for a full day of learning around the Common Core. And we have a subset of early adopter schools where we work directly with teachers because we know teachers are going to help us figure this out. And they're creating exemplars of high quality performance assessments, unit plans, et cetera. But it's the interaction between the learning at all those levels of the system that is really driving our strategy. We know we don't have it figured out. We keep learning and refining it, and I think that's the only way we're going to get there.
Okay. Marty?
Well, first, I think it's really refreshing and encouraging to hear the kind of discussions that Jen and her team are talking about. It's really nice to hear these things, these discussions happening. So a few ideas, and I'll try to be brief. One is I think we need to avoid the kind of what I call the feel-good strategies of the first two eras around standards and best practices. That is, teaching people about the standards doesn't translate into better classroom instruction. So I think we need to kind of stop deluding ourselves that silly alignment exercises actually improve instruction. I think there's a lot of less telling people what to do, and as Jen suggested, more showing people how to do things well. And I think there is some new tools and some new learning that have really emerged over the past decade around the use of formative assessment and formative assessment tasks. I've been working with Mary Jo Tavermina in a trust-supported project, working with a bunch of high-need school districts just outside of Chicago, on how you use good, solid formative assessment tasks to kind of create a new vision about what instruction looks like in relation to the Common Core. I think that's very promising work. But it's not just about the tests, and it's not just about the data. That's another big myth that I think we need to move away from. And in fact, I think we could argue pretty persuasively that both under the Vallis and Duncan administrations, there was a belief that if you provided schools with data, that the data itself would, and then quote unquote, inform instruction, and something magical would happen and things would change. And in fact, it's not the data themselves, it's the things that happen around the data. It's the kind of discussions, the unpacking of the data, the connecting the data to what's been going on in the classroom, and the thinking about how you move that forward that has to happen. And there was no investment in that kind of work before. It was too expensive, we were told, or there wasn't enough time for it. But in fact, data itself are not going to change the world. One thing we have to do differently with data is how we use it. I think in an era of tight resources, there's really little room for inefficiencies. And I think if there's a message from the curriculum side, is that maybe we need to rethink this idea of site-based decision-making totally around curriculum instruction over the past 20 years. If the needle hasn't moved, maybe we have to look from top to bottom, and maybe we have to look at that sacred cow a little bit and think about how the district can create a common vision, support instruction, get total alignment of this whole holy grail of instruction, materials, assessment, support, accountability. And I'm not sure you can do that when you've got over 600 individual units who are making decisions and do that efficiently. So I know that's controversial, and that would, it's a real culture change, but I would argue that it's something worth looking at. I think it's also getting the organizational house aligned. In particular, you need to figure out whether there's a district strategy and message about instruction and where it comes from. You have to figure out what's the roles, or the respective roles of the networks, of the Office of Instruction, of local schools, and you need to get people to buy in. I don't think it's about closing schools and hiring new teachers. I don't think that's going to move the system forward. I think that's been a kind of in some ways, as I think Elaine was talking about, a little bit overblown in that regard. I think a lot of it's about leadership, and I think one of the things that we under-resourced in Era 3 in mathematics is we didn't invest enough in helping school principals and school leaders and network leaders better understand how to move mathematics instruction forward. When we did a lot of evaluation, we looked at kind of the factors that were always present in those schools that did well and that were always absent in the schools that didn't. Yes, a lot of that aligned with the 5 E's, but there were some very specific issues, and then when it came down to it, it was all about leadership, and the principals in schools that were making it happen were putting these pieces in place. Principals who weren't were not. I don't want to overblow this in the sense to try to make it sound easy. If it were easy, then we'd have better results from our charter schools and more even results from our turnaround schools, because people are really working hard at this. It's not that this is easy work or there's simple solutions, but I think a bigger investment in school leadership around mathematics is important. And I think one more thing, and then I'll end, is Al kind of creeps up here, is that I think we maybe need to think about rethinking. There's kind of a hope that there's a common strategy, a unifying strategy that you can use for both supporting literacy, better literacy instruction, and better mathematics instruction. And I think the disciplines are different enough that maybe we have to think about those things different and just kind of acknowledge it. They don't have to look the same. So I'll leave it there.
Okay. I thought my creeping was more subtle than that. Let's open it up to either reactions to what the panelists have said regarding, what do we need to do next, or your notions of what has to happen next so that we're not in this same place again. We have to be more radical about this. We can't allow this to happen again. So this is an opportunity, it's a window, and we all ought to leave here upset. We ought to leave here angry that we haven't done more than we could. And if we don't have that passion of anger, I'm angry. I mean, I've got 4 twin boys in 4th grade, and what I know about those 2 boys is that they're only going to be in 4th grade once. And if teachers blow the chance to educate them, it could be over for them. And so we don't have this big window. So that's, okay, my cards are on the table. What do we need to do so that we're not here having this conversation again? We've heard our panelists kind of talk about what their vision is, and I'm going to talk to you about that chart at some point. All right, anybody? We're open. Over here. And someone will bring a microphone over. If you don't have a big voice, probably you do. But
I just, the main...
Your name and...
Oh, sure. My name is Jennifer Husbands. I work for the Academy for Urban School Leadership. And for me, I think that there's a really painful irony of what we're saying here, which is it's okay to raise the achievement expectations at the high school level, and we actually see increased graduation rates and increased ACT with more test takers, but then to be afraid to raise the level at the elementary to put kids on track for that. We are lying to children when we tell them, oh, you're on track, but you actually have to be in a completely different place to be on track. So maybe benchmark's not the right way. Hopefully we'll get some decent growth measures, but Lord, the people in this room, we need to not be afraid to tell kids the truth about what it's going to take to make you college and career ready, and not pretend like the benchmark where we have it now is fine because we want to say 50% are good and 50% are not good. That doesn't help kids.
Comments, questions, thoughts. This is your opportunity. We're kind of running on the witching hour. And so, over there.
Camille Farrington from the Consortium. But the question is mostly to you, Jen, in terms of time for professional development. So there's a lot of the barriers to achieving some of the things that you laid out are really structural barriers, time being a huge part of that, resources being another huge part of that. So what, just interested in your thinking in terms of the professional development time that it would require to really provide teachers with all of the skill sets and capacities that they would need to implement this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel very strongly that teachers need time for both short-term and long-term planning built into their schedule, which would mean weekly, time to plan with their teacher team, their colleagues in their grade level or grade cluster or course, whatever it might be, as well as longer chunks of time inserted during the school year where they can look at the body of evidence of, that they've collected over the course of 6 or 8 weeks, and then plan their next unit or units of instruction. So there's just a sufficient planning time that needs to be built into their schedule. I also think there has to be sufficient professional development time. A lot of times what I see in CPS is the cycle for data analysis and planning gets usurped by professional development opportunities because there's no other time for that to happen. So teachers get out of the rhythm of analyzing their data, planning, because, we've got to find time for professional development too. So I think that also has to be built in. And what I mean by that are our teachers need injections of new knowledge, to keep them excited about their profession and learning. I actually think that there are ways to do that. We're at a place where we're having conversations about the longer school day, what that will look like in the next year. A big part of the longer school day plan needs to be building in more time for teachers. And it's not just the longer school day, but what the school year can look like. So I really want to take advantage of this opportunity to think about how we could redesign the school year to build in those opportunities for teachers to come together.
Not thoughts, just thank yous. I just want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank the Chicago Community Trust. I want to thank the funds from the Earl Foundation and for supporting this work. Thanks to Peggy and to Gedalia for really encouraging us to do this work and giving us the opportunity to do it. Thank you very much to Jen Cheatham and to Marty Gartzman for coming and giving us your vision of how we're going to make this work. Obviously, there's a lot of work that the school district has going forward. The consortium plays a very small role in the big picture. We're going to keep trying to give good data and to try to supply the district with the information it needs to support good work going forward. So thank you all for coming. Bye.